Hitler had his own SA chief, Ernst Röhm, killed because he was gay, and he was executed in 1934. And yet the second most powerful man in the Reich appeared in public wearing makeup, jewelry, and red leather boots. His own generals averted their eyes. Foreign diplomats recorded the scene with astonishment. Mussolini's son-in-law described Göring's coat as something a high-class prostitute would wear to the opera. Hermann Göring was gay. What does the evidence say? And did Hitler know? And why did the same man who ordered Ernst Röhm killed for being gay tolerate the spectacle of Göring at his side? That's what we're going to find out now, together. The child of castles, Hermann Göring was not born into poverty. He was born into luxury, but into a peculiar kind of luxury, quietly stained by secrets that were never spoken aloud, only felt. From an early age, his childhood was surrounded by comfort, privilege, and a constant sense of exceptionalism. The son of a high-ranking German diplomat and a mother of working-class origin, Hermann grew up in castles that did not actually belong to his own family. They were properties of Hamann von Arstein, his Jewish godfather, an influential, wealthy man, constantly present in their lives, a man who also maintained an intimate relationship with his mother, something never officially acknowledged but impossible to ignore. Raised among servants, works of art, and vast ornate halls, Göring learned early how to move through that world of display. He learned how to take up space, how to be seen, how to carry himself like someone above others. He lived like an aristocrat before truly being one, but along with that, he learned something even deeper, that appearances matter, that power must be displayed, that the world, in the end, works like a stage, and whoever commands the scene controls the gaze. When the First World War began, he enlisted as a pilot. It was in the air, amid combat and risky maneuvers, that he found what seemed to be his first genuine glory. He shot down more than 20 Allied aircraft, amassed victories and honors, and received the Pour le Mérite, the highest military decoration of the German Empire. His rise was swift. He became commander of the fighter squadron that had once been led by the legendary Red Baron. Hermann Göring was brave, technically skilled, admired by his peers, and celebrated as a national hero. But beneath that image of bravery and success, something in him was already beginning to seem out of place. A subtle crack, still invisible, but one that in time would become impossible to ignore. The downfall and the addiction. 1923, Munich. The coup fails. Hitler and the Nazis try to seize power by force, marching through the streets with the conviction that history would open the way for them, but it does not. The Bavarian police respond quickly and violently, dispersing the insurgents. Shots ring out. Chaos sets in. In the middle of the confusion, Hermann Göring, who is marching beside Fina, is hit in the thigh. The pain is immediate, searing, almost unbearable. Wounded, he manages to escape. First, he crosses the border into Austria, then continues on to Sweden, seeking refuge and treatment. There, his wife Karen tries to care for him, following every step of his recovery, but the wound does not heal as it should. The pain persists, constant, dominating his days and nights. The doctors do what they know how to do. They prescribe morphine. At first, the drug seems to bring relief, but soon it becomes something greater, something deeper. From that moment on, Hermann Göring would never again be the same man who had returned from the First World War as a celebrated hero. In 1925, the collapse comes. He suffers a severe nervous breakdown and ends up committed to a Swedish psychiatric institution. The medical reports are harsh, almost merciless. They describe a highly emotional, hysterical, self-centered man consumed by a constant persecution complex and marked by a fundamental lack of moral courage. The decorated pilot, a symbol of bravery and discipline, had turned into someone unstable, dependent, and frequently violent, even toward his own wife. The war hero was now an addict, physically and emotionally adrift. And yet, despite the fall, he would return. Against all expectations, Hermann Göring would return to the German political stage and rise higher than he had ever imagined. The empire of excess. Well, with Hitler's rise to power in 1933, Hermann Göring quickly becomes one of the most powerful men in Europe. He accumulates offices with almost absurd ease. He commands the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force. He intervenes directly in the war economy, centralizes decisions, gathers titles, amasses property, and comes to function as a true pillar of the new regime, living like a Roman emperor. His main residence, Karenhall, a colossal estate north of Berlin named in honor of his late first wife Karin, becomes the perfect setting for a new display of power. It was not just a house, it was a carefully staged set, where every detail reinforced the image of grandeur Göring wanted to project. Diplomats, senior officers, and foreign guests arrived at Karenhall expecting to find a Reich Marshal. Instead, they often found Göring reclining on Ottoman divans, surrounded by rugs, fabrics, and exotic objects. Sometimes he wore Japanese kimonos. On other occasions, he appeared in Roman togas fastened with golden clasps. On his feet were fur-lined slippers. On his fingers, enormous rings that caught the light and drew attention with every gesture. He changed clothes several times a day, as if each moment required its own costume. A Swiss diplomat visited Karenhall and recorded his impression in astonishment. Göring was lying there with his trousers rolled up to the knee, showing cardinal red silk stockings, with a sullen expression on his swollen face, his mouth shriveled and puckered like an old woman's. The scene was both grotesque and revealing. The German diplomat von Hassel also described dinners at which Göring appeared in deliberately theatrical outfits, wearing makeup and covered in jewelry, turning official gatherings into personal spectacles. Even among the Nazis themselves, far from public view, he earned a nickname that said a great deal about how he was received: the perfumed Nero. So what do you think of this? Do you like this kind of video? Then comment, "I want more stories." That encourages us to bring you more historical topics and also helps the video's engagement, okay? Also, don't forget to subscribe, turn on notifications so you'll be notified as soon as we post something new, and leave a like so our videos keep being recommended to you. Now, let us continue talking about Hermann Göring and the question no one dared ask. The rumors were inevitable. In a regime that persecuted homosexuals with brutality, that arrested them, sent them to concentration camps, and marked them with a pink triangle as a sign of dehumanization, the second most powerful man in Germany appeared in public wearing makeup, dressing in an ostentatiously extravagant way, and adopting behaviors that many inside and outside the regime labeled effeminate. The contradiction was impossible to ignore. After all, was Hermann Göring gay? The question circulated in murmurs, whispered in corridors, discussed in hushed tones at diplomatic receptions and official dinners. But no one dared put it openly. No one had the courage to confront him. Göring knew how to be cordial when it suited him, but he was also brutal when necessary, fully capable of ordering arrests, destruction, and death without hesitation. And yet he still appeared at military parades with visible touches of makeup on his face, a discreet sheen on his lips, rings gleaming in the sunlight, a disturbing contrast amid the rigid aesthetic of Nazism. When Count Galeazzo Ciano, Mussolini's son-in-law and Italy's foreign minister, met Göring in 1941, he was visibly shocked. In his notes, he described the fur coat worn by the Reich Marshal as something a high-class prostitute would wear to the opera. The remark was not just about the clothing, but about the impression it created: excessive, theatrical, disconcerting. But what was really going on with Hermann Göring? Decades of historical research have found no concrete evidence that he had sexual relations with men. There are no accounts of lovers, no direct testimony, and no compromising letters to support that hypothesis. In this case, the documentary silence is significant. Göring was married twice and, by all indications, loved his wives, especially Karen, the first, whose memory he revered obsessively even after her death. Often to the displeasure and frustration of his second wife, the actress Emmy Sonnemann. So if he was not homosexual, what explained this behavior? Some historians and psychologists began to consider a different possibility: homovestism. The term was coined by the Greek psychoanalyst George Zavatsianos and describes a condition in which an individual derives psychological or symbolic pleasure from wearing clothes associated with their own gender, but in an exaggerated, obsessive, or deliberately theatrical way. It is not transvestism, it is not cross-dressing. In fact, it is the opposite: an extreme fixation on hyperbolic symbols of masculinity or femininity taken to the limit. Not as a woman, but as a man pushed into caricature, he dressed. Uniforms designed exclusively for him, luxurious, distorted versions of military decorations, his grand cross of the Iron Cross made of platinum, his diamond-studded pilot's badge. He wore makeup, yes, but he also wore red military boots, kimonos, and togas, men's clothing in other cultures, but profoundly extravagant in the German context. He displayed an excess of jewelry. Everything was showy, everything was exaggerated, everything seemed calculated to be seen. He did not want to be someone else. He was not trying to abandon his identity. He wanted to be himself, only enlarged, glorified, turned into a spectacle. A man who was not content simply to exist, but needed to be constantly staged, magnified, and immortalized. The stage and the mask. Hermann Göring was addicted to morphine, was corrupt, was lazy, especially in the final years of the war. He was brutal to subordinates and, at the same time, had the strange ability to laugh at himself, something extremely rare among Nazi leaders. He cried when he learned that he would not receive an Italian medal he wanted. He put on an absurd amount of weight during the war, while the German people went hungry under strict rationing. He stole works of art on an industrial scale, plundering Jewish collections across occupied Europe. And he wore his operatic uniforms, his glittering jewels, his silk kimonos, as if he were forever on a theater stage. Göring lived in a continuous performance, and perhaps that performance was the only thing left of a man who had long since lost control of his own life. The end of the show, Nuremberg. Hermann Göring takes his seat in the dock as the accused. The tailored powder blue uniforms are gone. The diamond rings no longer gleam on his fingers. The makeup, the jewelry, and the theatrical costumes are gone. All the pageantry that had followed him for decades is left behind. He is visibly thinner. For the first time in many years, he is free of morphine. His gaze is steady, his mind clear, lucid, and, to the surprise of many, still sharp. During the trial, he defends himself with intelligence, sarcasm, and calculated irony. At several moments, he seems to try to dominate the room with words, as if the courtroom were just another stage. He does not bow, does not show remorse, and does not ask for forgiveness. The sentence is inevitable. Hermann Göring is sentenced to death by hanging. But the end does not come as the court had decreed. On the night before the execution, alone in his cell, Göring swallows a cyanide capsule he had kept hidden. He chooses the moment and the manner of his death. One last performance, one last gesture of control. The question that remains, after all, is this: was Hermann Göring gay? The most honest answer, in light of the available evidence, is probably not a simple or straightforward one. Even so, reducing him to that question would mean losing sight of something far more complex, more unsettling, and more revealing. Göring was a man who defied easy categories, more troubled and more theatrical than history usually allows in a few words. A man deeply obsessed with his own image, addicted not only to morphine but to power, to luxury, to appearances. A man who turned his own identity into a continuous spectacle and paid the price for that performance with his sanity, his reputation, and, in the end, his life. Gary was not simply effeminate, as so many of his contemporaries insinuated with contempt or ridicule. He was an extreme narcissist, trapped in an endless performance, incapable of clearly separating where the real man ended and where the character he had created for himself began. And perhaps in the end that distinction no longer existed. Perhaps in the final act there was no difference at all between Hermann Göring and the mask he had spent his entire life wearing. Thank you for staying until the end. Don't forget to make sure you're subscribed, turn on notifications, and leave a like. Have suggestions for topics? The comments are open. See you in the next video. Until then, Amen.